Wow, good morning. I got lost there for a minute and didn't realize it was my time to come up. That music was incredible. I know you'll agree with me. Well, good morning, Buffalo. Nice to see you. I do have to admit that I am going to be speaking in English today. Jerry, I'm glad he shared the intro about me being Southern because when he introduced me as coming from England, I realized there could have been a great disappointment. I was preaching at a church in the South recently, and maybe this is a Southern thing, but everyone seems to be pretty infatuated with the royal family and Will and Kate. I get questions all the time about who is Pippa dating. I have no idea. But I was preaching a couple weeks ago at a church, and a little beautiful old lady came to me after the service and shook my hand, and she said, "Thank you for a wonderful sermon, but I have to admit I was extremely disappointed when you began to speak." And I thought, wow, thank you. And I said, well, what exactly do you mean by that? She said, well, he introduced you as coming from Oxford, so I thought we would get a nice accent. So I'm glad Jerry told you about the grits and tea and crumpets because I am indeed from Georgia, and you will probably hear that come across and not a nice little English accent. But it is great to be here, and it's wonderful to reconnect with Jerry and Edie and with their two boys, and really to see what all is going on here in Buffalo, and especially at this church, at the chapel. I've been listening for a long time on the podcast, but it's nice to be here in the flesh to see what goes on here in person. So thank you for having me. It's really an honor to be here. I'll never forget the first time I read a book called Birds Without Wings. Has anyone ever read that? Birds Without Wings? No one. You might know this author as the one who wrote a book called Captain Corelli's Mandolin, which was turned into a film in which Nicolas Cage starred. But I think this is his best novel. It's a book in which two young people find themselves falling in love. Two young children find themselves falling into a love interest in a small Anatolian town in the early 20th century. It's right at the start of the explosion of Turkish nationalism in an area that would soon become Turkey. And they begin to fall in love with one another. There's a lot of peace there in the town. A lot of people get along with one another. And it's really a charming story there at the beginning, and then it turns really into an awful tragedy. With Turkish nationalism on the rise, it exacerbates this already fragile strain on their love, these two children. Now, near the beginning of the book, Iskandar the potter, one known to invent his own proverbs, he says, "A man is a bird without wings, and a bird is a man without sorrows." And by the time we get to the end of the book, we find out what all the title really meant. Two of the characters, Mehmetçik and Karatavuk, which means in Turkish, robin and blackbird, their names themselves are plays on this theme of birds. They're trying as children to fly away from where they're at. But the words that Karatavuk speaks at the end, after the tragedies of war and the tragedies of a nationalism that became wedded to religious fundamentalism, he makes a statement that really lacerates your heart. He says, because we cannot fly away, we are condemned to do things that do not agree with us. It's a novel that induces tears and frustration and dismay at the reality of just what sometimes we get caught up in when things outside of our control happen all around us. It forces you to contemplate the nature of a humanity that sometimes is forced into these situations. Now, it's as I told you, it's a story that really impacts your heart. It really gets at your emotion. Now, you might compare that to my recent book. Now, my recent book is called Origenis Orientalis, The Preservation of Origen's Hexapla in the Syro-Hexapla of Third Kingdoms. It's not that fascinating love story. And in fact, while I may have encouraged you to go find out more about Birds Without Wings, and perhaps this afternoon you'll be at Barnes & Noble or Amazon looking into this book, I doubt anyone's actually going to be looking for my book. And that's a good thing, because sometimes I wonder why I wrote the thing to begin with. But that kind of book, it's a very academic treatment of something. I'm not even going to tell you what it's about because it doesn't matter. It's a very academic, very boring, very dry treatment of a subject matter that gets into something. It's important to me, but it's not going to be important to a lot of other people. In fact, the book itself costs $145. And lest you think that I'm getting profits off of that, my contract states that I get 0% on royalties. And the reason for that is because no one is gonna buy the thing, okay? So they're only gonna print about 5 to begin with, and hopefully 5 libraries out there might find it interesting to put on their shelves. Never to be checked out, of course. But what's true of us as humans is that we absorb and are moved by stories. We're not moved by treatments of a Syriac manuscript from the 8th century. We're moved by a story that tells us about this rise of Turkish nationalism. And while we may not go out and read a book about the history of Turkey, we might read this novel that's a historical novel that's set in this time, and that's gonna have an incredible impact on how we see the world. How did Jesus teach? He taught with a lot of stories, didn't he? And you remember last week, Jerry introduces this sermon on Leviticus by telling you what? A story about his dad's monkey business with, telling them to eat food, and if they didn't want to eat it, they needed to go look in Leviticus because the command was there. Because he knew no one was going to read Leviticus. But for this same reason, Leviticus 8 to 10 brings us into a new phase in the book. In Leviticus 8 to 10, we now get these stories that are putting into a narrative form all that we've read here in the first 7 chapters. So we get all this legal, ritualistic instruction in the first 7 chapters, and now we're getting into chapters 8 and 10, and we're gonna see this fleshed out